episode 9 of Only as Lonely. Hello, thanks for being here. Good to see you. You're looking well. Welcome to the 9th instalment where I share my story of going travelling, seeing sights, photography, playing music, and all the little funny interactions in between. So I am proper road tripping right now in my camper van. As you're aware, there's a banging sound, and I'm at Reed's Farm, a free site for travellers on the outskirts of a town called Taupo. Fortunately, it appeared to not be a hippie commune when I arrived, although who knows, maybe it was their night off. Today, I'm going to continue heading south towards my first gig in New Zealand's capital city, which is Wellington. So without further ado, seatbelts on please, no messing around in the back, eyes open, wide awake, let's go. September the 19th, 2009. As anticipated, thanks to the continuous bangs throughout the night, I had broken sleep and woke up like a zombie. Just Google Tales from the Crypt Keeper. You'll get an idea of what I look like. I was pretty convinced now that it was actually the bus, although it could have been a very persistent campervan lurker. So I eventually dragged myself out of bed at about 20 past 7 and it was bloody cold. Time for a shower. Hopefully, I could work it out and I wouldn't need the help of the emergency breakdown people again. There were certain technicalities to consider, however. Firstly, I'd have to get naked in the bus and make sure that all the curtains were fully closed. It was cold, after all. So I went to every window and ensured that every little corner of glass was covered up. Again, complete paranoia. The second consideration was the task of switching the shower on. Basically, the toilet area, it was a wet room as well. But that meant no shower curtain. So it's not like you can switch it on and then step in. I had to be in it and then switch it on. I also had the complexities of deciding which towel was going to be the stand-on towel and where to put the other drying towel. Bit of a thing with them, really, the camper van. Didn't really have anywhere to kind of hang things up. When all of that was decided, I stripped off, the cold taking my breath away, and I probably screamed like a little girl. Not the best when you're a lone traveller in a camper van. I mean, I don't need police storming the van thinking that a child has been snatched. So I quickly resorted to swearing like a bloody macho bloke. The shower worked pretty well. It was nice and hot, although I couldn't stay too long because I wasn't sure what the situation was with how much water I had in the tank. So after a couple of minutes, I jumped out of the shower onto the dedicated floor towel, back into the cold, and rapidly dried myself, shivering and shouting a number of expletives in a high-pitched fashion. But just as well, the curtains were well and truly shielding me from the outside world. This was going to be my life for the next month. Great, I sarcastically thought. So what were my surroundings like now that it was daylight? Well, where I was, imagine a field surrounded by trees and bush. That was pretty much it, really. There were a couple of other camper vans and a couple of tents, but other than that, I didn't see much. Having recently looked into Reed's Farm a bit more, I've since found out that it was situated on the banks of the Waikato River. I don't know if I've said that right. And campers could often spend the night beside the river itself, relaxing to the sounds of the rapid flowing water. So just as well, I wasn't there to spoil it with my high-pitched shrieks and pathetic gruff swearing. However, the site has in recent years been taken over. They've had some toilets installed and changed the name to Hipapatua, which is a Maori name. Camping beside the river is now banned too. I mean, I didn't see any of this while I was there. I should have got out and had a look, but I just assumed it was just a field. I was probably a bit half-soaked, really. New Zealand was now my oyster. and I had to decide what to do. So, over breakfast with my guidebook in hand, I tried to find something to do. I found that there was nearby kayaking activity centre and Hooker Falls. Kayaking seemed like a good start to my month of non-stop adrenaline and adventure in New Zealand. But when I'd pulled the curtain back, along with a fresh sight of the field, I'd noticed that it was very grey, wet and drizzly. Not great weather for kayaking. I mean, if there's one thing you don't want to get when kayaking through rapids, it's wet. I left the field, hoping to not get stuck, and made my way towards Hooker Falls. It didn't take long to get there. It was just a very short drive up Hooker Falls Road, and I parked up, donned my waterproofs, and followed the signs towards the falls. Surely, it must be quite a sight with all this rain coming down. Following the signs, I headed down the track, crossed a bridge over a river with a small waterfall, and continued up the path. Then I saw another sign for Hooker Falls, but pointing in the direction I'd just come from. Yeah. Transpired that the small waterfall I'd just passed was indeed Hooker Falls. Now, don't get me wrong, it was a lovely sight, that the torrent of rushing water, turquoise in colour, channelled between banks of rich green pine trees. It was a lovely scene, even on this cloudy, miserable day. But I guess I was just expecting something a bit bigger. I mean, there was a visitor centre after all. It was lovely, but it just didn't meet the expectations I had. Perhaps my expectations weren't realistic. I don't know. I mean, I wasn't expecting Niagara Falls, and the water was indeed violent. Violent. In a kayak, you'd definitely get some butterflies and a few farts if you were approaching it. But it wasn't a massive drop. And if you're going to give it its own visitor centre, then come on. It needs a bit more of a wow factor. Surely. Is that harsh? Am I being harsh there? But, it killed 10 minutes. At least I didn't drive for an hour to get there, So now what? I parked on the edge of Taupo and took a walk into town. It's a town that was clearly designed because most of the main shopping area is in grid formation, unlike the many cities and towns in the UK that began life as a small village or settling. The various lanes growing into roads and then growing into a large town or city status with roads going here, there and everywhere. The shopping area being a collection of various businesses, some independent and some no doubt part of a chain that I hadn't heard of. Housed within rectangular blocky buildings, there was a distinct lack of a sense of history or soul. Kind of like Milton Keynes in that respect. I suppose it's something that I've taken for granted living in and around Birmingham. The city centre in itself is a collection of old beautiful buildings, brutalist 60s concrete and modern glass structures which collectively gives the place a sense of soul, of history, of forward thinking and the contemporary. I'm probably talking apples and oranges here. I'm not criticising Taupo, I'm just trying to describe it, But Taupo was pretty busy, a hive of activity, and the epicentre of retail, no doubt for many within a certain mile radius. Whilst there, I called my Auntie Carol. It was always good to hear her voice again. Then I found a cyber cafe where I emailed the organisers of the gig I'd been booked for in Kerry. Got to say thanks to Tanya, who explained that it was quite a stretch to get to Kerry from Christchurch. I really didn't want to let anyone down, but at the same time, I admit I felt like a weight had been lifted off. After getting a bite to eat, I set off again. Once more, king of the road. I was counting my blessings. I had some good tunes on the radio, singing loudly along with the track Doorbell by the White Stripes. I had a toilet that I knew how to use. I had coffee in paste form, a high seating position, and a beautiful country to explore.
When you gonna ring it? Lake Taupo, baby. Alright. I'm driving my bus. I got a bus, baby. Yeah. Woo!
Right, I don't know why. I was going through a bit of a phase, okay, so my mate Sam and I would do this thing where we'd go, oh yeah, alright, yeah. We're doing all that sort of shit. It was a bit like Macho Man Randy Savage sort of thing. I don't know why. I mean, sound like a pair of teenagers. We were 28, pissing around with that. God, embarrassing, isn't it? But you're going to hear more of that, probably, some of these videos. Unbelievable. But, warts and all, so... Alright. I needed to get to Wellington for a gig the next day. Wellington is at the very bottom of the North Island, so I'd continue on Highway 1, heading south, initially following the edge of the huge Lake Taupo, before veering away through wooded areas, leaving Taupo far behind me. After a couple of hours of driving, I crossed a bridge entering a little village. I can't remember the name, and as I looked to the right whilst crossing the bridge, I saw a number of guys fly fishing in the river. A little voice in my head said, "Stop, have a look, check it out. You might get some interesting shots." And I listened to that voice and parked up in a nearby social club. With my camera and all-terrain Converse footwear, I headed to the river to just have a gander. Stepping on the large pebbles that made up the riverbank, I approached an older fella who was almost up to his waist in water. He saw me approaching, and with his flat cap and green waterproofs and waders, he seemed very chilled out, flicking his line back and forth, hoping for a bite. So I referred to the fail-safe conversation starter that I used to use as a youngster towards fishermen in Westmeadow Park. Caught anything? That was it. Got chatting to John, who hadn't been very successful that day and had got up at stupid o'clock in the morning to make the journey down to this river on his own to stand in the water and flick his rod back and forth. Whatever floats your boat, I guess. We talked for a short time, and I think he enjoyed the break from the mundane. People like it when others show an interest in them, I guess. I also asked if I could take his photo, and John kindly agreed. Well, it's not every day that you stand in a river fly fishing and get approached by a stranger from the other side of the world asking about your hobby and wanting to take your picture. I then moved further down the riverbank to get chatting to a guy who was much younger, and by the looks of it, much more successful than John with the fishing. His name was Andrew, and he had his teenage daughter with him. I watched him flick the line to almost the far side of the river, and when he got a bite, he would quickly pull back on the rod, which would bend to almost a U shape. I was surprised at how giving the rods were. He explained that this was one of the best rivers in the country to fish for rainbow trout. There were certain rules they had to follow, however. They could only catch fish that were a certain size. He had it marked on his rod so he could measure the size of the fish, and then if they weren't big enough, he'd have to let them go. They were also only allowed to catch and keep 3. After that, every fish would have to be put back. His daughter's job was to take the fish, hit it over the head with a rock, remove any roe, and then gut it. She wasn't squeamish, and clearly handy with a knife. It was then no surprise that she said she'd like a job in medicine. Yeah, I thought she'd be handy with a scalpel. Most teenage girls would probably prefer to do something else other than stand by a river and gut fish. She seemed really into it though, and I sensed that despite her parents having separated, this was a good way to have a bond with her father. It also highlighted to me how much this country's culture is very much an outdoor affair. It's no wonder the Kiwis are so proud of the country that they've got. It's so beautiful in so many different ways, and they appreciate it. It's also the reason why it's such a big tourist attraction. I must have spent about an hour there talking to them and watching them do their thing, with only the sound of the wind blowing the trees, the rushing water of the river, and only the triumphant cheer of someone getting a catch every now and again. I found it very relaxing. Friendly people, happy to just chat to this English bloke who seemed quite into fly fishing. Do they not have fly fishing in England? Well, although usually I couldn't care less about fishing, I guess it was different being in such lovely surroundings. It's a stark contrast to going down to the local canal where you could cast your rod and catch such fine examples of shopping trolleys, bicycle wheels and used condoms. I had experienced fishing as a youngster. My mother's brothers, my Uncle Colin and Uncle Ronald, and my auntie's husband, my Uncle Tom, are all keen fishermen. As a youngster, maybe about 7 years old, I'd stay at my nan's, sharing her bed only to be woken by a shove at stupid o'clock in the morning. My Uncle Colin waking me up, then I'd sneak downstairs, try not to wake my snoring nan, where Colin would make me a cup of tea and a couple of slices of toast. Then he'd get all his fishing gear out of his shed, boxes, deck chairs, rods, tackle, bait, and on a small trolley we'd head down the road to Westmeadow Park, which was literally, like a 2-minute walk away at the bottom of the road. There they had a large pond, and in the dark, in the cold, Colin would set up the rods for us. Not much of a talker, my Uncle Colin. He'd just sit there in silence and watch his float and smoke cigarettes. I just sat there trying to keep warm, watching the little orange float on the water. Bored shitless. God, it was boring. Despite it being boring, I still did it 3 times from what I can remember. Once I caught a tench. That's it. Perhaps it was the novelty of doing something different and being away from my parents that was the appeal. God, it was boring. On one occasion, I'd been sat there watching a float for what seemed like hours, but then my dad turned up to see how we were getting on. I was happy to see him. I asked him if he was on his lunch break. Nah. He was on his way to work. He started work at 7:30 in the morning. I've got a few more hours of this left to do. Brilliant. Don't get me wrong, I appreciate the idea of sitting out in nature, enjoying the peace and tranquility, even in a park on the outskirts of Oldbury in the Black Country, but it wasn't for me. And I never liked the idea of yanking something out of its habitat with a hook through its mouth and then pulling it back. If you're going to eat it, then fair enough, but otherwise I feel like it's cruel. They say they don't feel pain and the hooks don't hurt, but how do you know that? The fish has never said, yeah, it's a bit of a shock, don't get me wrong. I mean, 1 minute I'm seeing some breakfast, lovely maggots. Next thing, I'm being pulled out of the water, hanging in the air, then I'm being held down while they remove the hook, have a quick photo taken, struggling to breathe, and then they throw me back in the water. But no, it doesn't hurt. But despite fishing not really being my thing, for me, it was nice just to have that interaction with people. And perhaps this was just an excuse to take some photos and talk to someone. Not that I was desperate or anything, but I had told myself before this trip that as I was throwing myself out there into the unknown, I couldn't be shy. I'd have to get chatting to people. I took shots of the men in the water. When I say shots, I took photos. I didn't have an air rifle with me. I took photos of the men in the water, Andrew catching a bite and his rod bending under the strain, and his daughter showing me a freshly caught rainbow trout. I bet it would taste amazing being so fresh. Mind you, I wouldn't know how to prep it, and no doubt it'd stink the bus out, and that wouldn't go down well if I was, to have any visitors. Not that any fish was on offer, anyway. I wished them well and headed off. Once again, the terrain changed, and I found myself on the desert road. A long stretch of road with nothing but dark brown brambles and dry grass on either side. A landscape that looks charred. To my right, in the distance, was a dormant volcano, capped with snow, and under this very dark grey sky, it was understandable why they used this place to film part of Mordor in Lord of the Rings. The terrain is dark, dry, and with the horizon dominated by the volcano, it seemed as though it was created to be portrayed in such a way. Further down the road, the landscape changed once more, as the road began to twist and turn through the landscape, which now consisted of little green hills and bumps until the far horizon. You know when you're in bed and you've got your knees pointing up to the ceiling under the covers? Imagine that over and over again, for as far as the eye could see, as you zoomed along in between these bumps, and sometimes over them in the bus. What do you think when you're driving for hours? Well, there were a number of things. Memories of working in my last job, thoughts of friends and family and wishing they could share this with me. I was thinking about what my set list would be at the gig, how it would be received, and all the time being mindful to keep my eyes open and take it all in, looking for more opportunities and experiences I could stumble across. I didn't want this to be purely a driving holiday. I'd kind of experienced that the last time I'd been here. Then once again that landscape changed as Highway 1 led me alongside farmers' fields that were now flat. It was as though I'd been transported to Norfolk. Luckily, though, I hadn't. I had my iPod playing through the radio transmitter that I'd brought with me, and the day was getting late. The sun was starting to come down. I hadn't found anywhere to stay, though, and the campsite signs that I was seeing weren't clear to me whether camper vans and buses were accepted. So I turned off the main road and headed down a country road to see what I could find. At one point, I stopped to take some photos of some cows in a field with the low sun in the sky behind them. It's always a challenge when it comes to exposing for such a shot. It wasn't quite the golden hour yet, the hour at dawn or dusk when the light is golden and perfect. As such, the sky was still a bit bright. If I expose for the cows in the foreground, the sky is overexposed and burnt out. If I expose for the sun, the shutter speed will be super fast. I won't get any of the detail in the cows or the foreground. They'll just be silhouettes. I played about for a bit with the settings and then I had to get a wriggle on to try and find somewhere to stay for the night. And I wanted to find somewhere whilst I could still see what was outside. I settled for a lay-by somewhere between the towns of Palmerston North and Fielding as I was losing the race against the sun.
Captain's log, stardate 19th September 2009. I've been driving for about 4 hours. 5 hours. 5 hours. And I'm losing the race against the sun. So I haven't managed to find a campsite. But I don't need no campsite, motherfucker. I'm in a camper van, Shaman. So there's absolutely nobody around. I've found a spot. You can see those are my neighbours, those cows are my neighbours. There's the boudoir. That's the other side of the road. And there's no sound. It's very quiet. Marvellous. So this is where I'm going to stay tonight, baby. Alright.
All right. Again with the all right, Idiot. Right. With cows as my neighbours, I sat and played some guitar for a while. It soon got cold and I had beans on toast for dinner. Something simple, but I was mindful that a strictly toast diet was not the way forward for an intrepid explorer like myself. I deserved finer cuisine. There was fresh beef in the field next to me, but it's a lot of hassle, isn't it, to take down a cow? But at least the gas that would later follow under the duvet, courtesy of the beans, would help keep me warm. I lay under the duvet, writing my journal, and the bangs started again. Again, I would jump up and look out of the windows. I'd take stock of what weaponry I had to hand should there be a crazy farmer man outside. I kind of realised that a butter knife and a fold-away deck chair were not practical alternatives to a big stick. I'd already decided that there were bus noises. But for some reason, feeling this isolated and not being certain of what the cause was, it was still quite disconcerting. As the bangs continued over and over again, I thought that it could be the gas or water pump in the bus. I couldn't let my paranoia get the better of me, but at times, it did. In recent years, I've learnt a bit about how we can be controlled by our emotions. If you imagine you have two systems working simultaneously. One system is all of your rational, logical, concentrated decision-making at the front of the brain, which takes up a lot of energy to process. The other is at the back of the brain, which runs your impulsive, emotional responses designed to make quick decisions with energy efficiency because it's designed for fight or flight. When the two come into conflict, it's always the emotions that win because it's the primary emotions that are designed to keep you alive. And it's better to make a wrong assumption and be safe than to try to rationalise and not act at all. Well, fear is one of those primary emotions, and it was taking over here, even though I'd concluded this very morning that it was a bus noise that was causing the banging. I'd start to let my imagination run away with me, thinking that maybe a car's pulled over with a madman inside and he's going to try to break in. In hindsight, the odds were very low of that happening, but equally, an ideal crime scene, without any witnesses, without anyone hearing your screams. I was working myself up here. I tried to calm myself down by telling myself that equally, the possible would-be murderer wouldn't know how many people were in the van, or equally, how big they'd be. If only Xena, the jazz lesbian, was here. I could send her out to investigate. I did eventually, after psyching myself up, stick my head out of the door, and sure enough, there was no one there. I got back under the duvet, and as I wrote my journal, a car went by and beeped their horn. That would happen every now and again. I gathered it was either to wake me up if I was asleep, or to be cheeky, thinking that there could be a couple hopping on the good foot and doing the bad thing, that kind of oi oi, beep beep type of thing. Cheeky. It was a bus, after all, far too big for just me. Easy to assume that there'd be a couple on board. Don't get me wrong, the bus was rocking, but only because it was exposed in the open and being buffeted by quite strong winds. I was cold and still a wee bit anxious. Surprising how different it felt knowing that there was literally no one outside this time compared to last night. It's so isolated. When you're at home, maybe you share your home with someone. They're usually in another room, perhaps. But even so, you've probably got neighbours. If you live in a home that's adjoined, then that means that really they could be only just a few feet away. If you're driving around your local area, you'll see others on the road, probably pass by other people's homes, knowing that there's someone probably in them. If you go to the shops, you see other people. You may not be very far from other people at all in your day-to-day. If you need to talk to a friend or a family member, you can just pick up the phone. But not here. Not for me, right now. I think this was the first time I'd ever been truly isolated. It was so cold, I had to keep my clothes on under the duvet and kept my woolly hat on. I got an early night. The next day, I was bound for Wellington, the country's capital, to play my first gig in New Zealand. That's it, that's day 9.
Do you like that?
Not a lot happened in this day, admittedly, mostly driving, but there was the impromptu stop to talk to the fishermen. That was good, and I'm glad that I did that. I listened to that inner voice that encouraged me to talk to people and capture some shots with my camera. I was surprised by how the terrain changed throughout the journey today. It went from countryside and wooded areas to the desert road, then to those green rolling hills, and then Norfolk, just flat fields for miles. Kind of like putting blocks of Lego together in a row. We'll have a wooded block first, then a desert block, then a green lumpy block, and then a flat block. Staying in a lay-by. That was something I'd not done before. First time I'd ever felt truly isolated, I suppose. So you notice things, isn't it? Only in comparison with what you're used to. Like the sounds, for example. At night, you might hear the sound of your other half breathing or snoring next to you. They might move, so you hear the sheets and duvet moving. A car might drive down your road. You might have the odd house noise that you get used to. Maybe a plane flies overhead. But here, in the van, out in the sticks, nothing. Maybe the rustle of trees with the breeze, but otherwise nothing. Apart from those bloody bangs, of course. Even though I'd pretty much established that they were definitely coming from the bus itself, there was still that irrational thought of, yeah, but what if that one wasn't the bus? What if that is somebody banging on the bus? I suppose that's the thing when you're with someone, isn't it? You've got someone to talk you down. Someone can be the rational voice when you need to hear it. When it's just you in your own head, it takes real self-awareness to just to catch yourself and go, hold on a minute, calm down. At this point, although I was well aware of feeling isolated alone, I wasn't feeling particularly lonely. I guess I'd gotten used to the feeling of the trip now. Having that small conversation with the fisherman kind of broke things up a bit. It is great, though, being able to stop and sleep, and shit and shower exactly where you park. It's quite liberating. Yeah, so that's that. That's day 9. So thank you again for listening. You know the score. Please like, share, subscribe, all that jazz. And check out onlyaslonely.wordpress.com for photos, clips and songs from the trip. I'll see you next time for episode 10. Quite the milestone, isn't it, 10? I look forward to you joining me on this trip to Wellington and my first gig in New Zealand. Cheers. Bye-bye. Oi, oi.